I'm a bit screwed now because I'd planned to spend the first 20 minutes talking about myself, so not sure what we're going to do here. I need to start off before we do anything else by saying if anyone would like to make me feel better and move to, the first 3 or 4 rows, I would encourage you to do so, but only if you wish to. I also want to mention that this is a lecture hall, but I don't want to give a lecture. That's not. I'm not a teacher. That's not my background. I'd rather this be a little bit more of a conversation. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit. The topic of this discussion is purposely vague: the importance of independence. So that can mean a lot of different things, and I'm going to interpret it a couple ways, and then talk a bit about the world of independent film. So, just to jump off, let's see, the next 20 minutes will be about me. So my background, as Robin mentioned, is I came from Eastern. I was a journalism major, and I was really interested in reporting and storytelling. And pretty soon after graduating and getting out into the professional world, I found myself really attracted to film. And it's an elusive thing. If any of you have been to some of the other panels here with Luke and Craig earlier, you sense the tone that the film industry is not a welcoming one. It's one that you have to overcome obstacles to get into oftentimes. That's true from a Hollywood perspective, but not quite as true from an independent perspective, from the point of view of just wanting to create film for film's sake. Less the commercial, more the artistic. So as I started learning about film, watching more film, and kind of absorbing it, I found myself really drawn to a lot of independent cinema and films that weren't being shown at the local multiplex. So I just use that as my departure point so that you understand my background of how I even got involved in this. I'd never even been to a film festival before until I covered one when I was based in LA, and I covered the Sundance Film Festival. And I attended, and it was the Sundance was the biggest film festival in the country. It was the very first festival I ever went to. And it was there that I was really exposed to all the different segments of the independent film world: the producers, the sales agents, the filmmakers, the distributors, the publicists, a whole gamut. And I started to see that there was perhaps a place for me in that independent world. And that's led me a few years later now. I do run this film festival in North Carolina, which has been around 10 years. It's my 3rd year as the director. And my job is, as Ron mentioned, is to program the festival, to find the films for it, but also to raise the money for it. Matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, I launched our 2008 fiscal year 2009 donor campaign in the midst of a recession, which is a fantastic time to ask people for money. But we've become a festival that's very successful in what we do. We show a lot of international films, films that just come from outside the mainstream that are escaping the regular multiplex. And that's kind of where I'd like to start off with discussing, is that kind of film. I really want to talk first about kind of the importance of film. You're all here, obviously, because cinema, in some sense, has an importance in your life, or it means something to you. Film is an incredible medium. The impact is immediate, and it has a power and an immediacy that you can find in other art forms, but it's just not quite like it is in film. We were discussing it on the way here, and cinema really is the best way to get inside the artist's head. After you've sat down and watched an hour and a half film, you've just been immersed in that artist's world. And you can do it in theater, you can do it in concerts and in other live performance and in paintings, but it's just not quite the same as a passive absorber of what's happening up on the screen. So film, to me, has developed into this really powerful tool. I see probably on average between 300 and 500 films a year, documentaries, student films, narrative features, and I see all kinds of films from all kinds of places. And the films that I see are sort of a window into all these places and people and experiences that I would have never had access to. And I think that is actually the central theme of what I'm going to use today, and that is that independence in cinema is really what that leads to is diversity of voices, of perspectives, and of opinions. Independence at its core means alternative and additional and nuanced ways of looking at things. We all know that at the multiplex, any given weekend you can see lots of entertainment. pardon me, you can see, the new Batman movie. You can see all the comic book characters of the rainbow. You can see, the big splashy things, the new Atonement, the new Keira Knightley film, the new Tom Cruise film. And those are great, and they have a place in the world. And I love some of those just as much as other folks do. But the independent film world, which presents a broader spectrum of the world and windows into places that we don't see every day, I think has a place that is often overlooked. So I'm going to get back to that. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to discuss the different sort of facets of the film industry as it relates to the independent cinema world. But I want to talk for just a moment about art. Touring this facility today, it's a really impressive facility. And it underscores this thought that I have that art is, well, first of all, art, not all film is art. I think we can all agree to that. But some film is art. Art is subjective, and if I mention any film titles here as being either good or bad, that's either my opinion or one that I've agreed with that somebody else said. It's by no means correct. So when I make fun of the new Batman movie or Spider-Man or whatever, I don't mean it as a slight or that I know what I'm talking about. It just means that's my opinion, and you all obviously have your own. But when you have, the thing to keep in mind is that art can't be forced to happen. Art is something that just happens. Cinema isn't something that can be made to be good. And for an example of this, I think it's good to look at Sergei Eisenstein, who made, for instance, Battleship Potemkin, which is one of the classic films and one of the classic directors of all time, and whose work still inspires to this day. And scenes and cuts and styles of filmmaking that he sort of originated and invented are still used throughout cinema today. And he came from a very oppressive, brutal regime, which was very restrictive, constrictive, and had very regimented rules and ideologies to work within. And yet, out of that came this beautiful, flowering, blossoming vision. And throughout his career, he demonstrated that time and time again, that he was able to just pull from the ether these visions and this creation that was inspiring and we celebrate to this day. Now, if you look on the other side of that, compare that to George Lucas. Here's a man who made untold millions, and then when it came time to go back to make Star Wars, his new trilogy, he literally had the pocketbook. He had the ability to fund anything in the world that he wanted. He had the world at his fingertips. He could make anything he wanted. The sky was the limit. And he created the 3 new Star Wars movies. And I think we'd be very hard-pressed to find people who really, truly could call that art, what he created. So it's an example of a restrictive world where the least likely chance that something beautiful would emerge is where some of the most enduring classic things came from. And then another place where you had, in the future with Lucas, where you had the unlimited opportunities where it, in a way, fell flat. And again, I want to underscore, when we talk about art and cinema, I don't mean that films that are not art are not good, because that's also not a fair thing to say. Pardon me. So that's the thing that we know as artists or as critical watchers of cinema, is that art and cinema, great cinema, as in great art, requires talent and it requires vision. But I think also important is perspective. And again, that's what the idea of independence brings to this. In the independent film world, which is existing concurrent and overlapping with the mainstream world that we're all familiar with, cinema happens and is shown and exhibited around the world at festivals and in art houses. It's made by people in Charleston, Illinois, to Los Angeles, to Bangkok, to the furthest reaches of Africa. It's cinema that happens from all areas. And that cinema has a real value. And it's important, again, to remember that just because you have resources or the means, that it's not necessarily going to be great. That money does not actually equal quality. And we know this in art, but I just want to mention this, that this also translates to cinema. Money and means and opportunity is useful and can often lead to some great advances and some great opportunities, but it does not necessarily guarantee great cinema or great art. So with that, I wanted to kind of break down and talk about the state of the cinema, of the independent world today, and what this all means for us. To start with, I want to talk about the filmmaker, which is where ostensibly the independent film world germinates from. Is the ideas that people have, the films that people create out in wherever it is that they create them. The world today of film, again, just to underscore what Luke and Craig were saying this morning, is a very complex one filled with obstacles. And if you want to be a filmmaker or a screenwriter or a creative professional in some way with regard to cinema, you have to find your way. And for generations now, a couple generations now, the independent film world has been the entry into that, into the cinema world. And why is that? I mean, it makes sense. Before you're ever going to be trusted to helm an $80 million or $130 million budget with Tom Cruise sitting out in his trailer, you are going to have to prove yourself on a short film or a smaller project. Before anybody's going to entrust hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment, and you don't know what you're doing, you have to have the experience of making it on something much smaller. So independent cinema has been used as a pathway, a gateway, if you will, to get to the broader commercial world. And I mean, again, this is just common sense. And it's the aspiration of many, if not most, independent filmmakers to ultimately become one of these commercial filmmakers paid, untold hundreds of thousands or millions for your work. But there's many of us who have sort of, in the last 30 years, who've become professionals or have become involved in the independent film as kind of a separate entity. It exists sort of for us separate from the commercial art world. Companies have sprouted up, and the film festival circuit, which we'll talk more about in a bit, has been created to foster the development of these and to further the audience awareness of these films. For filmmakers today, it's very unlikely that you can write a script, submit it to somebody who, through a friend, can get it to an agent who can sell it to get it to Paramount or wherever, that it's going to sell, that they're going to buy it, they're going to give you the money or the opportunity to make a film and to put your vision out there. That's just a very unlikely path. It's the equivalent, if not of winning the lottery. It's like becoming a professional basketball player. The odds are just against you. So what happens is filmmakers today, and for the last 20, 30 years, have gone on smaller paths, and they're making much smaller, more intimate personal films. And for those of you who know anything about the Sundance Film Festival, which originally started off as a festival really showcasing these independent works that were sprouting up just all over the world. And there was no place to, particularly this country, and there was no place to showcase them, really, in a prestigious environment. Sundance was created, Robert Redford came on much later, and sort of helped foster this environment of showcasing independent cinema. These films began to get more popular. The independent brand, so to speak, became more popular. And people liked this idea of the not outsider art, but it was independent, it was separate, it was gritty, it was the quality stories that weren't being told in the mainstream system. So people began to be attracted to this. First the filmmakers, then the actors who saw the great opportunities here, and screenwriters, and eventually the money came. After the creative professionals came, it came the money. So what ended up happening was distribution companies began setting up specialty divisions to purchase, to acquire, sometimes to produce films that were made in this independent sphere and then distribute them to their audiences. They basically wanted to acquire this independent brand. I mean, many of you know Miramax, the company that was founded by the Weinstein Company, the Weinstein brothers. They started out very modestly making documentaries like The Policeman's Ball and really simple films that they were acquiring for very low money and cutting them, turning around and making a modest profit off of them. And the more that they did this, the better they got at it, the more money they made. Eventually, it became a really sexy business model, and it became, Wall Street began looking at it saying, look at this company here that's making consistent profits. And so Disney came in and purchased it. I can't remember how much it was for. The figure 300 million pops to my mind, but that may not be accurate. And this was, 15, 20 years ago. Well, in that wake, companies like Paramount and Universal and New Line and Warner Brothers began creating their own specialty divisions. Things like Warner Independent, Fox Searchlight, Universal Focus, which became Focus Features. And these companies became the major players in this independent world. So what ended up being established was a system whereby filmmakers wanting to get into filmmaking and wanting to become filmmakers, if you will, would make their projects, and the first sight on their horizon was to get a film purchased by one of these distributors because it would have the corporate muscle behind it and it would be pushed out to theaters around the country. Well, it worked out pretty well for a little while. Some companies like Sony Pictures Classics, obviously owned by the Sony Corporation, have had a long history of having consistent success at this. Their niche is purchasing international films from around the world and that aren't being shown here, being released here, and releasing them in a handful of theaters in New York or LA. And they're hoping for modest success. And they've been getting it, and they continue to get it. Other companies, however, took bigger gambles. Like last year we had There Might Be Blood, or There Will Be Blood, as was a good example. Cold Mountain with Miramax was a good example. These were companies that took big leaps. They suddenly began spending the kind of money that the parent companies would spend on a major film, the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And that really changed the game, because suddenly it went from a business where you were looking to make a couple $1 million on a film and do it consistently and make modest profits and really push art film out there and really acquire the films that nobody was seeing into, let's get the biggest celebrities we can get into it, let's get it out into as many theaters as we can get it to, let's sell as many tickets as we possibly can cram people into. And that's the business model of the parent studio. And as long as you're making big commercial successes, then it's going to work. But if you don't have the pocketbook to support that, as most of these specialty divisions didn't, it doesn't last very long. And what we've seen literally this year in the last 6 months are a number of them closed down. Paramount Classics closed down and folded its division within Paramount. Warner Independent closed down completely. Any films that were to be due out by them were now going to be released by the parent studio. Tartan Films, which is a small European distributor, had an office. They closed down. There's a lot of these independent companies, these specialty divisions, in this year, literally in the last 8 months, have shuttered. They've closed down because they can't make it work. It's not entirely the fault of the distributors, perhaps. This business model that I spoke of trying to get singles and doubles versus home runs, it's also a changing marketplace. In the last 15 years, the number of art house cinemas around the country has dropped dramatically. And the movie-going public has been trained. We're all trained. If you really think about it, when you think about cinema today in America, it's just not geared toward art or geared towards experiencing a diverse slate of perspectives. It's geared toward what's the big thing that weekend. I'm sure you've heard other people talk about, once Jaws hit, the whole industry discovered that, wow, we can make hundreds of millions of dollars instead of just a couple million. And we can, if we put all the marketing money behind a film, a title, we can explode it and we can have lines around the block. And as long as we have enough films and we push it out there fast enough, and so we have another one next weekend, and we just keep doing that, and we have this intensity that you have to get to this film this weekend and then it's over and it's gone, I guess you can sustain that. The way films used to be released, and just looking out here, there's a number of you who were around when this happened, it used to be called a platform release, where a film would be released in New York for a few weeks, and it would get some positive word of mouth and some good coverage in the New York Times. And then a couple weeks later, it would maybe go to Chicago or Boston or Philadelphia, and it would expand, and maybe it would go on a road show where it would go to Cleveland, then Pittsburgh, then Miami, and it would go around the country collecting positive word of mouth. And when it finally came to you, you were excited to see it, and you'd heard about it in Time magazine, or if you subscribed to some of the movie magazines back then, you'd go see it. But it became such an urgent thing to get that film in front of everybody all at once, that sort of discovery process of discovering a film was lost. One of the last films that has really undergone that discovery roadshow process that I can think of is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was released in a handful of theaters and became an unexpected success. They didn't anticipate this. The company that distributed it thought that it was going to be just a real modest little fun film, and audiences began flocking to it. And so they ended up having to make more prints and spend more advertising and do it more and more. Because they hadn't anticipated it at the front end, they didn't have it all ready to go to just push out. So it was a gradual, many weeks process of just cranking out the films, the number of prints that they could to distribute. And audiences discovered it that way. And it just kept building, and people went to see it multiple times. That's what the way that cinema used to be. Now we've got it so that we're seeing the grosses, the box office grosses, in the newspaper every Sunday night or Monday morning. And it's almost like box scores in a baseball game. What film won this weekend? Was that ever the objective? When did film change? When did we look at the amount of money that a film made as being the ultimate goal? I thought it was supposed to be how it reached people or touched you or what kind of an impact it had. So I got off topic there a little bit. Filmmakers, how does this all impact them? What's happened to them? Well, again, it used to be that if you wanted to work in film, the equipment and the technology was so expensive that the only way you could do it was work your way through the Hollywood system until ultimately you got your break and you made your feature. Till Francis Ford Coppola tells young George Lucas that yes, you can make THX 1138, and it falls flat, and you think you're never going to make another movie again until somebody else gives you your next break. But with the emergence of these specialty divisions, and there are a lot of art house distributors, particularly in New York, lots in LA, that also specialize in this smaller fare. A lot of international cinema. And when I say smaller international cinema, I mean, keep in mind, in America, we've kind of got blinders on, and so when a film like Amelie, or Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Life is Beautiful is played here and it's pushed out by a company, we're thinking, where in the world did this come from? This is incredible. But every year, films like that take off around the country in indigenous countries, and we'll never see them. Or if they come to the country, they'll play in New York in a couple theaters. We just do not see the bulk of the cinema that's created in this world. We're lucky if we see a small percentage of it. And that again goes back to my theme of independence. The independence in cinema means having access to that. Independence means having art house distributors and specialty companies that are going to take a risk and spend small amounts of money to bring films and to show them. And the structure that we live in now is built so that David Letterman can promote one film that night and Jay Leno can promote another, and that's how we hear about it. We're going to watch the trailers on Apple QuickTime, and it's not built for discovery. It's built toward maximum impact all at once. So, but in that niche, I keep doing circular logic here, in that niche, filmmakers have found their place in these specialty houses, these specialty companies. And there's many filmmakers who've made a home for themselves by making these specialty films. Obviously, somebody like Jim Jarmusch is a great filmmaker whose work is not broadly commercial, but is very has a broad audience in the specialty market, in the independent or art house market. And there's filmmakers like Sofia Coppola, who started off that way. And there's certainly many other filmmakers who started off making very art house films and progressed into the Hollywood system. We were talking about Tim Burton, who's somebody who I don't know that he's ever even made an independent film, yet his films feel so much like that, which reminds us that, again, art can happen anywhere. You can have great cinema made with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, and it can happen when you've got $30 at stake. Another good film I can think of, by the way, that proves this example of cost and price has no bearing on quality is a film called Tarnation, which was made just a few years ago, if anybody's heard of. It's a documentary. It's a man's made this film about his sort of personal journey about his mother's illness and how she ultimately died, and his sexuality. And he filmed footage of himself and his family for 15, 20 years on just simple VHS cameras and little Super 8 cameras. And when he got old enough, he made a film out of it. And he estimated when it was submitted to Sundance, because it was accepted and played there, that it cost him a grand total of something like $360 to make. Well, I mean, that's a very unlikely story, but it happened. And a company came in and bought it for $1 million and pumped another $1 million or $2 million into it to clean it up and put, buy the music rights for it and really make it something special, and put it out, and it was very popular. So again, you don't need money to be successful or creative or create art. But as the system kind of over the last few years has kind of ground down and these companies have started to go out of business, filmmakers are finding themselves standing out in the cold, kind of saying, well, what's happening here? Where am I going to show this work? Whereas before there was a defined path, so you don't have to try to go straight to the Hollywood system. There was kind of a ladder. Now that ladder is starting to miss a few rungs, and people are trying to figure out, well, where do I fit in? And the internet and cheaper technology has certainly played a part in that. And you obviously have all heard of YouTube and a lot of the impact that that's had on filmmakers. I just would say though, and I find this whenever I have discussions with other festival directors or people who aren't filmmakers, and even a number of filmmakers, I suppose. I was at the Toronto Film Festival a year ago, and they had before every film they played trailers, and they had a commercial from Motorola, which was showing. Was promoting this big new thing about films on your Motorola phone. And of course, we all know that the iPods and the Apple iPhones, they all have this video technology, and it's great and fun and wonderful. But I look at that and I wonder, what filmmaker in the world wants to have their work exhibited on a 3-inch by 3-inch screen and that's it? Like, that's their aspiration. That's certainly not proven to be a moneymaker yet, but this whole brave new world of digital technology has opened up new avenues for films to be exposed. And I think it's really exciting because on things like YouTube, people vote for what they like, and they vote for what they want to see. And people view over and over what they want to see, and they'll recommend it to their friends. So there's no money in it, but there's an awareness building in it. So as a filmmaker, you can get your work seen by more people than you perhaps could have if your film was distributed in a theater. And to give you that sort of side of the story, I want to tell you about a film called Ballast, which is a film that played at the Sundance Film Festival this year. It was produced by directed by a filmmaker. I think his name is Lance Hammer, which is a great sort of porn name, I think. But he's a filmmaker, so not that I know anything about porn, by the way. Lance made this film, and it was well received critically at Sundance, which is to say, it was a bleak and depressing film. Sundance is known for that, but it had a lot of admirers and a lot of people really were behind it. It's a story of a rural black man who tries to commit suicide after his brother is killed. He survives, and his brother's widow and his nephew basically move in with him, and it's about all these obstacles and challenges they overcome to sort of move on with their life. The ballast of life, I guess, is the analogy there. The film screen, and all the distributors saw it, and IFC, which is one of the, many of you may have that on your TV channel, but they also purchase films, and they have a theater in New York that they program, and they show films from all around the world, all these independent films. They purchased it, and they were the only ones that wanted to do so at that, I guess. The thing is, the way the business model has become, all that they were really going to buy the film for was $60,000 or $80,000. So independent films and independent filmmakers do not make a lot of money. That should be clear. There are some rare exceptions. We can talk about some of those later, but this example is one that I think is the standard versus the rule versus the exception. So Lance and his production team, they sell their film. They're about to sell their film to IFC. So life is hunky-dory, right? Well, then I guess they start looking at their contract, and they start seeing that, well, IFC is really only going to guarantee that this film goes in 1 or 2 theaters. They're really only going to guarantee X percentage of marketing put behind a film. Because these are the kinds of things you negotiate now as a filmmaker. How many theaters is my film going to go into? How much money are you going to put behind it to market it? Are you going to put me on Letterman? You're going to hire a publicist for this? Like, what are you going to do for me? So I guess what the negotiations broke down at the last hour. The sale had already been announced. IFC had put it on their calendar, they were ready to go. But I guess before the lawyers finally allowed the signatures to be signed, the filmmakers behind Ballast pulled out, and they said, you know what, this is not what we want. This is not the vision we had for this film. We don't think that this film is best served by just throwing it up in a couple theaters and trying to get a review in the New York Times, and maybe it'll get out on DVD and a few people will see it. So instead what they did is they decided to distribute it themselves, self-distribution, which is also called four-walling in the film world, meaning you basically rent the theater, the four walls, and you screen it yourself, and you keep all profits. Of course, you also take all the risk. You spend all the money, your money on marketing, and it's not the best way to go, and most filmmakers are not business savvy enough to take that route, but these guys did. At this point, it's still up in the air about how that's turned out. I don't think that they've broken any records, but I think they've raised awareness for this film particularly. So more people are aware of this film because of the controversy surrounding it, and because of their pulling their film back from the jaws of IFC moments before they did whatever they were going to do with it. Another interesting avenue for filmmakers that has emerged is we all have heard of Netflix, I'm sure, the online company that will mail you DVDs. They also now, you can watch films online, streamed, and this is something that is exciting, and a number of other companies have jumped up on this. And they're now streaming movies online, and you can pay services to watch them, or you can some of them are just free. Just go watch these great films. And this is now a new business model. And in the last 6 months, literally, this happened over the summer, they hired a former festival director at the South by Southwest Film Festival to come in and find a way to monetize this, and to find ways of making money out of this digital screenings, these streamings. And they've started to do it. And what's really exciting is they've started to pull films that had screened in the past that have sort of been lost to time. Films like Whit Stillman's Metropolitan, which he's a really interesting independent filmmaker. That his work is kind of very small and personal and had some resonance. He did like The Last Days of Disco, if anybody saw that. But this is a film that then was given a new life by being screened online or streamed online. So filmmakers are now facing really unusual challenges when they're making their work. If they're shooting for art, if they're shooting for cinema, and they're shooting to make something with a voice, the avenues to them are more limited than they were before. By the way, I don't know if you figured it out, but I kind of ramble and go back and forth, weave between things. So I have a structure in my head, and I'm clearly not sticking to it, but we'll get you. I'll take you on your journey here. We'll get you your independent cinema story. This ties into producers and production companies. This is the next place I want to kind of steer the ship here. In this brave new world of independent cinema, producers have a real daunting challenge, and that is, again, I don't know how many were in Luke's discussion earlier this morning. I keep referring to it. I know I see like 2, 3, 4 of us. I think I don't want to abuse the references there too much. One of the nice things that Luke did this morning was mention, here are the different people in the film industry: agents and lawyers and managers and writers and actors, and what do they want? I thought that was a very prescient thing. Like, what is it that they are looking for? And producers want to get the film made. That's the number one thing, because that gets them paid. But they want to get the film made. And producers want to do it any way that they can. In the independent film world, the money that we're talking about is typically so much less than it is in the commercial Hollywood world. I mean, we're talking about anywhere from a couple $100,000 all up to $15, $20 million could be considered an independent budget. I've seen $40 million films be considered independent films, which I don't know about you, but once we get up into the $40 million, it's not so independent when you think about it. But these producers now are struggling to find sources and places to get these films made, and their motivation to get a film made is now, a lot of them are with Sundance and with the avenues that they've found for getting films out there, and the reduced number of places that it's available, and this sort of new monetized world that the specialty divisions were looking to really, emulate their parents and do really big pushes of films. It naturally has tended to lean more towards celebrity and wow the big noisy, expensive things. So that, again, that's like there will be blood. So the push has been often to find people to populate these films, filmmakers to create this artifice, this exciting, glamorous, independent world, when it all started from just people wanting to make movies, when it all started from much humbler beginnings. Production companies in today's world are, I mean, you all know that in America, we don't have publicly funded art to the degree that we do in Europe or other places. Canada, Mexico even has a small subsidy program. And the National Endowment of the Arts used to fund artists directly, but a number of years ago they got in real hot water, and that got to be a question of who gets to be the arbiter of taste. And it was decided that we don't want our government to be the arbiter of taste. Yet in other countries, they recognize that art and pure art, and cinema in particular, isn't necessarily going to happen unless you put the money forth and you really put an emphasis on it. So, I mean, I can speak from a little bit of knowledge that, for instance, in France, they have a tremendous number of subsidies compared to what we have. And the money that it makes, a lot of the cinema, the art cinema that we see in coming out of France, it comes from the national government has funding. Regions, you would literally have like Coles County Cinema Development Board, which would give money to somebody who wants to make a movie in Coles County. You have that to that extent in France. It's a culture that's built more around expression versus the commerce of film. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm really bashing it and saying commerce bad, art good, but it's just when we're talking about the availability of voices, the diversity of voices, if you leave it up to commerce, if you leave it up to the marketplace, what we see is that we don't get stories from Africa. You don't get a vast majority of the documentaries. You don't get access to see things that you will elsewhere. Which then brings us to distributors, which I've spoken quite a bit about already. Distributors are the companies that will look at the world of film and acquire and pick up or produce the things that they think will make money, that will enable them to stay in business and show more, produce more, showcase more. And distributors today are scared out of their gourds. They have no idea what's happening to this business. They're seeing audiences turn away from the cinema because it's so expensive. I don't know, when I was 10 years ago, when I was in school here, it was, I don't know, it was $5 or $6 to see a movie here in Charleston. I don't know what it is now, but I don't imagine it's quite the $10, $12, $15 it is in LA or New York. $8, I don't know what it is. But it's very expensive to take a family of 2, 3, 5, 6 to see a movie. And home technology has increased to the point where people would much rather sit at home and have their big screen TV and their surround sound and their comfortable chair, and that jack off who's sitting behind you munching on his popcorn and just talking throughout the entire movie to his girlfriend. You can control your environment. So people have really embraced home technologies, and it's hurt the theater-going population for cinema. So in one sense, if you look at the annual reports for attendance at films, you'll see the money increasing, the revenues increasing each year from film going. But that's a fake number, because if you look at the number of people, that's either held steady or slightly deteriorated over the past few years. I think it's probably worth pointing out that in America we're very focused on dollars and box office and how much money did Iron Man make this weekend, versus in most other countries in the world, when you're talking about the success of a film, you're talking about the number of entries. How many people went to see it, or how many people bought a ticket, how many people walked through a door to see it. And that's a much more meaningful number in the rest of the world than the actual dollars or money taken in. So distributors are really scared right now, and they're seeing the films that they purchase not lose hand over fist. And they're seeing their endeavors almost like Vegas now. It's a crapshoot. You have to take 20 big risks in the hope that one of them pays off. And if that's your approach, if you've got to throw 20 dice and hope that one of them returns big and makes up for the losses of all the others, you're really not going to, devote the personal time, attention, love, give it a real specialness that a lot of the independent cinema requires. You're not going to really care so much if you don't, well, you're not going to take the risks. You're not going to take the risks on cinema that requires an extra push. You're going to retreat back towards more simplified, easy to understand stories, films that don't need a lot of extra attention. So it's really a miracle, I think, when films like Napoleon Dynamite or Juno, which are kind of some of the most accessible independent films out there. Napoleon Dynamite was the most profitable film ever to come out of the Sundance Film Festival's narrative competition program. So out of the 16 films they show there every year, I think it made $40 million roughly in theaters. I have no idea what it did on DVD or merchandise. They were even selling moon boots at one point with Napoleon Dynamite brands on it. But that film made more money than any other independent film to date had. Another good example of huge success in recent years is March of the Penguins, which was actually a French film with documentary about penguins. But in the original version, all the penguins had French voices. They were all an individual character, and they had the subtitles underneath it. Warner Independent came in, purchased it, stripped out all that crap, and hired Morgan Freeman to come in and created a voiceover, ended up making $70 million. So distributors literally looked at that and said, that's what we want to do. That's what we want to do. We want to buy films for like $1 million, and we want to make $100 million on them. That's what we want. That's what we need to be doing. Well, that's a really unlikely scenario. And what we saw then was at Sundance, which is the de facto premier market for new American independent cinema, distribution companies came in and they would try, they would fight and jockey over films that they thought might be that next $100 million hit. And every once in a while, somebody gets lucky and they pick up a Little Miss Sunshine and it rolls to high profits. But more often than not, you end up with clunkers, and the prices started jumping. The highest price ever paid for an acquisition out of Sundance was Hustle and Flow just a couple years ago, and they signed a 3-picture deal with the producer of that, John Singleton, and I think the film's deal was like $20 million, and I think it made nowhere near that. So it's the money game became, I guess the theme that you're picking up here is that the film world began treating the specialty or independent world like the film business of yesteryear. And they're only now trying to really grasping that times have changed and that the old business models aren't working. One really exciting example of new thinking in this is a company called Emerging Cinema. So Emerging Cinemas, I think that's what it's called. It's a company that decided, well, one of the problems, this is all tied together, I promise. One of the things that's wrong with cinema today is that it requires such an investment of equipment and infrastructure to show. Walking around this building today, I kept looking at all the different rooms and thinking, can't show a 35mm movie there, can't show it here, because it requires hulking projectors, ceiling vents, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of sound. And a lot of people think it's a dying medium anyway, so new monies are not being put into that. Money is instead being put into digital projection and digital sound, and that makes a lot more sense. But the industry isn't there yet. They're not distributing their films on digital or high-end video yet. So companies, there's this weird tug of war where the exhibitors, the theaters that you go see movies at, are saying, yeah, of course, we'd love to have a server in the back room where you upload the movie to, and we're going to watch it and project it, and it's going to cost us nothing to have the print sent here. It's going to cost you nothing to have a print made. It's just we're going to push a button in, and there it is. It's going to cut everybody's costs dramatically. But if we're going to do that, you're going to pay for the equipment, Mr. Studio. And the studio says, wait, us? What are you talking about? You're the moviegoer. You're showing it. It's your business, your deal. So there's been a real tug of war, and only in the last 5 years or so have the theaters and the distributors kind of come to some agreements, and you're starting to see more and more experiments being made at some of these theaters. I don't know if the one down here at the highway has gotten that far yet, but we'll see. We're seeing it definitely. Los Angeles and New York are the leaders in this, but they're starting to pop up around the country. So back to my emerging cinemas story. This is a company that looked at rooms like this, looked at old libraries, looked at classrooms, looked at museums, and said, these are institutions and places where cinema should happen, where people should have the option and be able to see cinema, new films. But because of the vast, really expensive technological needs, it will never happen there on a regular, sustainable way. So they began selling a service, basically like this computer server I was talking about, and a digital projector. Great, that's just technology. What's so special about that? They then went out and made deals with all these different distributors, these exhibition companies, to say, look, we're going to pay you money to let us show your films on this service. And the studios started looking at this saying, wait, holy cow, this is it. You know, we're not having to spend any money on prints. I should also mention, I suppose, prints. When I mention this word, we all grew up watching movies in the theater, and they'd have the big projectors in the back running the 35 millimeter film, and they'd have multiple reels, or they'd have a big platter, 6 feet across, streaming the film across the room. A print, a 35 millimeter print for a standard length film is enormously expensive. I don't know, I've never made one, but I've heard anecdotally you could spend upwards of $30,000, $40,000 on a print, maybe, substantially more. So if you multiply that times the 3,000 plus theaters or screens we have in this country, you start getting an idea of how much money these studios are spending just to create the medium that is then shown to us all. So when you start talking about eliminating that entirely and allowing a company to push a button so it's delivered to you or you or you, and it saves millions and millions and millions of dollars and completely changes the game. But we haven't gotten there yet, and because of the sort of specific technological needs or requirements of that equipment and the sheer number of conversions that have to take place and the training that has to take place in order to make that happen, it's a slow process. But a lot of people have predicted within the next 10 or 15 years we're just going to see the death of film or prints entirely. I, for one, hope we don't, but that's a whole other story. So distributors like Emerging Cinemas, like Miramax, like anyone else, Paramount, they're all having to find new ways of making money, and they're all having to find new ways of distributing films. And this is an enormous challenge, particularly in this environment where there are fewer theaters and fewer places for them to be showing films. So that's that piece of it. We now come to the part of the program which I could talk indefinitely about, which is the ace in my hole. I feel comfortable about this topic and how much time do we have? I could go on forever, so we'll have to stop me at some point. And that is film festivals. Where do film festivals fit into this process, or this whole world of independent cinema? Film festivals really, I should actually put, I always forget to do this. Does anybody have any idea who founded the very first film festival or what the very first film festival was? Would anybody like to take a stab at this? No? The very first film festival ever created was the Venice Film Festival. And we owe its creation to Benito Mussolini, who created the framework for that being able to happen. So there you go. Fascism left us with at least one good thing. We've all heard of film festivals. I've mentioned Sundance already. The film festival I run is certainly not Sundance on any scale. It's a very small regional festival. Other significant festivals are the Toronto Film Festival, the Cannes Film Festival. Berlin has a tremendous one. You could go on and on. There's many film festivals. By some estimates, there's more than, I just did this the other day. There was something, I was talking with some people, and we were saying, how many film festivals are there? And it's a funny game to play because there's no way of knowing. Because some art house theaters will call themselves a festival. The Music Box Theater in Chicago, for instance, claims to have like 20 festivals a year. Hey, this weekend is the Festival of Romanian Cinema, and next weekend it's the Festival of Fassbinder Films, and next week, it's not, the definition of festival is flexible. So, but there's certainly more than 1,000 film festivals in this country, and more than 3,000 in the world, which, if you look at that, means roughly 3 festivals somewhere a day are happening in this country. And if you work in my industry, that's very easily believable. Film festivals have staked a claim for themselves as the place to showcase independent cinema and international cinema. These voices, these different, these diverse voices that we're not seeing elsewhere. And if you're an economist, you may look at it this way, that the film industry put all of its eggs in this big, splashy commercial basket and left an opening. And so other people rushed to fill that niche. And film festivals have certainly filled that niche in recent years. In the state of North Carolina, there's more than 25 film festivals. They range from, some are animation festivals around the country. We've got documentary film festivals, festivals that showcase international cinema specifically. There's festivals for screenwriters, for cinematographers. There's a festival for editors. No matter what kind of interest you have in cinema, there's a festival out there. And the value of festivals, again, is that they foster conversations and they showcase divergent voices and allow audiences to discover again. Because again, commercial cinema or commercial film has gotten away from that. So festivals have really emerged as the one haven for independent film, where everyone is there for the love of cinema. The downside, though, is that filmmakers have, there's very little opportunity to grow beyond that. And if you look at the numbers, it starts to get really bleak. Earlier today, we talked about the numbers of screenplays submitted to Hollywood studios, particularly this one that Luke, the gentleman earlier today, was talking about. Film festivals are just as bad, if not worse. The Sundance Film Festival receives, in 2007, they received, I believe, 7,700 film submissions. These are completed films, mind you, that were done, that were sent to them for consideration to show in their program. Our festival received about 1,100, 1/7. So if you look at that and you say there's 7,700 new films, being new films, brand new films, that they're going to have a whole other 7,700 next year that were submitted, and they're only going to showcase 100, 150 of them. You know, where are those films going, and what are those films? Who's making these films? There's a vast quantity out there, and festivals around the country and around the world have picked up that and are playing them in different capacities. We show films that aren't shown elsewhere. We show films that other festivals show. There's a giant overlap, and there's developed a festival circuit where a film will premiere at Sundance, let's say, or Cannes, or Toronto, and will then go through the next 12 months, 18 months, even 36 months, showing at other festivals around the country. And it's literally, remember I discussed this roadshow concept and the platform concept of releasing a film. This has replaced that. This discovery of cinema has emerged, or has become, it now lives in festivals. And the job of festivals, as I see it, is to find, well, first of all, it's to respond to your audience. Our audience in particular is very passionate about seeing things that they're not seeing elsewhere. There are other festivals which are really geared towards just finding the coolest, hippest things they can, the newest things they can, the premieres, the celebrities. No matter what you like, there's a festival for you. So festivals have a real strong role to play in this new world of independent cinema that's developed and that's emerged. And of course, what else am I going to say, by the way, as a festival professional? I hope I don't lose my job. That's where my bread and butter comes from. And then, because I want to kind of wrap this up and get to some questions if there are any, the next step, which festivals obviously wouldn't exist without audiences. And audiences are the last major component of this. We've gone through filmmakers and producers and distributors and festivals. It's important to talk about audiences because you've heard it, I don't know, sometimes I feel like concepts that I see over and over in documentaries are concepts that everybody's hearing or seeing about or thinking about. So when I say what I'm about to say, I don't know if this is something that's really been reinforced much in mainstream media. I know that it's something that I've been seeing quite a lot in documentaries. But related to the food industry, there's been a lot of talk about organic and local food. And if that's what you want to see, you have to vote with your dollars. And if you want to see more organic oranges and apples, and you want to buy your produce from a local farmer, then you have to go to your local farmer's market. And the more that you do that, and the more money you spend in that, that's only going to further the cycle. And you're going to see more of that and more of that. By some of the faces, I'm guessing I'm the only one who's hearing this message. So I apologize. The same is held true with cinema. If you are interested in different voices, and it's okay if you're not. If you really would rather just veg out and watch Breakfast at Tiffany's, and that's the height of your film weekend, that's fine. There's a place for you in this world. But if you want to see new cinema and exciting voices, then you owe it to yourself to seek out that cinema. Now, living in Coles County or Charleston, it's probably a little bit difficult to find that new cinema. So how do you get to it? And the answer to that is increasingly becoming the digital options, and going through Netflix and seeing films through the online screening processes. Interestingly, what we're going to start seeing more, I predict, in the next few years, companies like Netflix, which are big aggregators of films and are showcasing them to vast numbers of people all around the world, are going to start having really solid metrics. Well, they already do, but they're going to start kind of emerging in the way business is done. If we start seeing that documentaries really are leading, are emerging as a very popular big thing, if more and more people are watching documentaries, again, because there's been kind of a wane in that, then you better believe that we're going to start hearing more about it. That, hey, there's this emergence of real online consumers watching documentaries. So that's really the best way for people outside of the major media markets to be able to see films. But it's more than just doing that. It's sort of demanding, you want to demand quality cinema. So you want to visit quality cinema, you want to see quality cinema, you want to talk about quality cinema. I have friends who take trips to New York just to see movies, and that's their whole weekend. Not something that we can all do, of course, but it'd be nice. In kind of summary of all this, I wanted to talk about, very quickly, in conclusion, I guess, about where this all fits together. And that is, in the media world, there's been a lot of talk. I'm a former journalist, so I have some experience with this, of the coalescing of the contraction, I guess is a better word, of the number of media outlets. So where once before all your newspapers around the country were locally owned, now they're being picked up. Radio stations around the country have been merged into one giant conglomerate. What you've ended up with are gigantic entities which control different media outlets. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not preaching that this is the end of civilization as we know it. But what this leads to is a reduction in the number of voices that we get. And when you transfer this to other concepts like cinema, like film, which has an immediate impact, which enables us to gain a perspective on the world, independent voices around the world coming to us through many different mediums in many different places, if you suddenly have a fewer number of people who reign in that process, if you have fewer people arbiters of what we see, of what we're allowed to view and think about, then it drastically reduces our perspective on the world. And I think it all comes back to perspective. Film provides perspective, and independent cinema in particular provides a perspective that we don't get otherwise. So I believe that independent cinema, its role in our world is to provide a perspective that we don't get. And I think that filmmakers will increasingly see that trying to emulate Hollywood films or trying to just make a movie so that they can get their foot in the door is not necessarily going to be the clearest path, or that's not going to lead them to the best results. One would hope, coming from the sort of art point of view, that filmmakers and distributors and hopefully festivals and audiences and producers will begin to see that the reduction in the number of outlets and voices is bad for business. And the more opportunities we have to see things we're not used to see things we're uncomfortable with, that we're unfamiliar with, the better off we're going to be. And the better we're going to understand the world, the different people who are around us, the different cultures. We don't want a homogenous culture. So I think that hopefully my message of positive is that we're going to see more of this as we move forward. That the popularity of film festivals, the popularity of the internet is going to lead to more divergent voices. So that's my prepared spiel. I'd like to open it up to any questions if anybody has any. And I plead for you to have questions because we have to fill another half hour or so. So, does anybody have any questions about anything I've talked about, specific, general, or otherwise? Your turn. Go ahead.
What you're talking about is happening all across society. I mean, there's a concern about the corporatization of the media so that we have fewer sources for more objective or different perspectives. I know in the music field, there's the concern that, you know, if you're with the record selection and you're not going to have much of a chance. And there are two different things that I've heard about that are kind of interesting. One in the music world is a program called Concerts in the Living Room, where there are artists now that you contact and they have like this association, and they try to hook you up with professional quality musicians that will actually come and perform in your living room for like 20 or 25 people, and you provide them like a fixed fee, and then you know, have them on top of that. So that's one way to sort of get around this. I don't know how that would apply to cinema, except that
If you're going to feed them, I'm sure filmmakers would love for you to pay to bring them into your living room.
well, it's also the issue of the equipment. I mean, you can show a movie now in just about any spot. You can hook up a player with a digital projector and some sound system. But it's a question of the quality of the experience, obviously. That's the issue too.
And that's an important component of this because cinema can be shown on any wall, on any surface, but unless it's at a certain level of quality of projection, it's exactly what you speak of. I would argue you're missing out on a huge a piece of what it has to offer. I mean, for those of us who grew up watching Star Wars on TV, the first time when it was re-released and you got to watch it in widescreen, it was a revelation of, oh my gosh, look at, I was only seeing a third of the movie. There's literally 2/3 that I was missing this whole time. So your point is very well taken.
And then you mentioned, touched on a little bit, how much, in terms of media for marketing, Obama's campaign is a perfect example. It's mastered a means to reach people through the internet, through email and all of that. And there are prototypes out there that people are developing to engage people in the cinema, saying, using some of the same techniques or similar techniques.
There absolutely are. A good example of that would be, when I worked at the Chicago Film Festival, I was the director of publicity. I had a nice little office in Chicago that was on top of the Oriental Theater that looked out onto the park on State Street where everybody would have they used to have the skating rink set up before they built the new Millennium Park. And it was just a gorgeous place. I once watched a building burn down from that window, by the way. But right outside my office was the guy who booked all the flights for the filmmakers. His name was Joe Swanberg. He went to Southern Illinois University, which has a pretty good film program, as it turns out. And he one day walked into my office and said, hey, I have a movie that I made with my friends. Would you be willing to watch it? And I watched about 20 minutes of it, and I'm not going to describe all that was in the film, but let me just say this. If you want further description afterwards, I can tell you privately. But it was not the kind of movie you want to see your coworker in. It was not a porn, to be clear, but it was certainly much, much more of him and his girlfriend than I had ever been interested in seeing before. But this film was part of a new movement of films called mumblecore, which were very extremely low-budget films made with non-professional actors, non-professional crew. I think mumblecore, I think the term was used because the sound is often kind of bad and crunchy, and you can only kind of hear what people are saying. And there are often stories revolving around 20-somethings and 30-somethings. And this film, he actually sat down and we talked for a little bit, and he was asking me, what can I do with this film? Do you think that this is going to do, can I do something with this? I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, gosh, I don't know. I don't want to pay to see this. I don't know anybody I know who'd want to pay to see this. But I gave him a couple festivals to look at. South by Southwest, which is known for really grungy, independent things that can't even make it into Sundance. Montreal and some of these others. And lo and behold, he did go to those festivals, and his film did show. And his film became this sensation in the independent world. And he became like the indie darling of the year. And I mean, his films are not the kind that are going to be distributed widely, but it was purchased for distribution. And a company paid money to him to distribute it in theaters. And I still am shocked to this day, but this man who I think he's a great guy, and I think there's room for him, certainly, there's room for everyone in the film industry. But he's somebody who really built his career. It's kind of overlapped a little bit with the traditional models that I've talked about, but he really built his career on do-it-yourself. There's a lot of DIY filmmaking that's happening now. They say, you know what, I don't even want to go the route of distributors. Some of you are saying, screw festivals. We're just going to do cinema. We're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to just bypass all the machine, all the system. And, you know, as we all know in the art world, when you run into people who say that, just screw everything, screw the rules, sometimes you end up with brilliance, but more often than not, you end up with mediocrity. But in his case, he ended up being able to really utilize the internet, utilize things like Facebook and text messaging, and he really built an audience for his film. And it had a lot to do with playing at South by Southwest, which is a perfect festival for that kind of a film. But he went on, and there's been many others like him in the last 3 or 4 years, to say, we're going to just do it our way. And Ballast, the film I spoke about, is an example of that, but there's a lot more of them. And there are people who are, I think, wrongly, but that's my traditional filter standing up here. A lot of filmmakers are saying, I kind of don't care the quality in which you're going to see my film. It used to be filmmakers were just, you have to see it in perfect conditions with the perfect projection, the perfect sound, and if you don't, I don't want you to see it at all. I don't want you to see it. A lot of filmmakers 15, 20 years ago would just freak out if they knew, or with the idea that film festivals like mine view their films on TV, on DVD. No, they would say, you have to see it in a darkened room with an audience, and you have to sit there and have it happen to you. Well, frankly, in that scenario, it's a lot harder to walk off or walk out, and I like to sometimes stop and fast forward, but that's a whole other story. But what this gets to is that there are a lot of circuitous routes that people are starting to take, and I don't think you're going to see this as the dominant method that people make movies, because ultimately, deep down at their core, people want to make movies that are seen by broad audiences and that are, you know, they want to see money perhaps, they want to get acceptance, they want to have bigger opportunities, and until that circuitous route leads to those resources, I think you're going to see people continue to find the shorter routes. But I think your point is a very good one about leading to DIY. Yeah.
How do places like organizations like Apple Shop, who are they're reinforcing Appalachian film, but distributing film primarily through websites,
Mm-hmm.
And Women Make Movies is another one.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do those sort of fit into the picture of independent film?
Well, that's sort of like film by subscription in a way, and there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's quite a few that have popped up. Women Make Movies is a good one you mentioned. There's another one called Film Movement. There's another one called, it's a spiritual film. I don't know what it's called, but it's a spiritual film company. And I think this is really interesting. Their market is even smaller than the specialty distributors. They're basically saying, not only the Hollywood studios not covering it, not only are the specialty divisions not covering it, like television isn't doing it, internet isn't doing it, so we're going to do it. You're going to pay us a monthly fee, and we're going to send you a disc of the hottest new films by women directors that aren't in these other models or these other places. This is a trend that's going to continue. It's been happening for a few years, and I think it's going to continue to happen. I think that it's the equivalent of subscribing to Cat Fancy. Like if you really, really, really want to spend a lot of time like on cats, and you really want to see Appalachian films or films by women or black films or spiritual films, and you're not getting them somewhere else, you're going to subscribe to your Cat Fancy thing, equivalent thing. Until if one of these other models begins to start showing these films, they're going to lose their relevance. But I think that for the time being, nobody is jumping up and clamoring to showcase lots and lots of films by women directors, an area which I think is a tremendous crime, by the way. So, yeah.
Coming from journalism, when you run a publication, you do the function of agenda setting and gatekeeping. In other words, gatekeeping what are you going to put in the publication, agenda setting where you're going to put So if I'm in charge of your film festival, or if you're in charge of your film festival, which you are, your job is to be commercially viable because you got to raise enough money so it'll happen next year. So often popular films are sort of at your mission, which is to give diversity voice. Not always, but often. So I'm sort of asking you, you and your committee, do you have this ratio of, okay, here's a film we know will interest a bunch of people, but here's the ones that we think will change their lives or make them give them new perspective. So how do you program that? Do you have
Yeah.
a 3-to-1 ratio? What instruction do you give to the people who are jurying your films?
Sure.
How do you construct that mix?
Well, that's a good question. How do we basically pick our films, and what's the criteria in a way that how do we decide on the ultimate selections? It really is a gut level thing, and it changes every year based on what's available to us. Some years, and I've been running this festival for 3 years, but I've been involved with festivals for another 3 or 4 before that. So over the last 6 or 7 years, the films that are selected are specifically directly related to what's available to us. So for instance, in 1 year, we may have a big, my first year at River Run, for instance, I suddenly had access to any new film that was distributed by, I want to say New Line, but it may not have been New Line. And it just so happened that the month of our festival, a couple weeks later, a big Antonio Banderas film was coming out. I still to this day have not seen this movie, but suddenly if it's available to me, and I was assured by the people who I worked with that it was okay, it was an acceptable movie, hey, we're going to show that thing, and damned if we didn't sell 900 or 1,000 tickets to it. You know, from a commercial point of view, we absolutely have a goal of having a couple of marquee slots in the festival where we're going to showcase something that is commercial. But often the things that we show are not commercial in the traditional sense. Our opening night film last year, 2007 for instance, was a film called Paris Je t'aime, which was something like 17 or 18 stories, little vignette stories about love, different types of love in Paris, starring American and French actors and directed by American and French directors. And each one had a little vignette. It had a lot of well-known people, but it was not the traditional, typical kind of film that you'd see in theaters. So it fit our sort of niche, or our kind of approach to cinema. We absolutely do not have like a quota. Like we need to have a commercial film and an art film, and a commercial film and an art film. We have some specific slots in our festival, in our program, that we want to have more commercially viable films. Our opening night is a good example, and most festivals will try to program their opening night film as the biggest, most exciting, splashy thing as they can, often with a celebrity in it. You know, this year we had a film with Bill Pullman and Felicity Huffman and a number of other people in it. And we had one of the actors come and the director, and it was a very wonderful experience. Well, then the next day, then you can go see a movie about a 3-hour Romanian movie, with Armand Desante or something in it. That's not going to be shown in 99% of the theaters in this country. Or a documentary by a great documentarian about how Chinese herbal teas come to market. So is a great film, by the way. So we absolutely don't have a quota or look to fill a niche. We program on what strikes us. And some years, if you look over at least our festival in the past, you'll see some years that are more sort of populist in a way than others. But we always try to maintain a balance. And there's always that sort of voice in the back of my head kicking me when I start looking at the almost completed board of what the films we're showing. And for instance, I start noticing, hey, we have no black faces in this. There's no black directors, or there's no women directors. And I believe strongly that they're out there. You have to find them sometimes, but you have to look for them. Gay lesbian directors and stories of interest of all the different ethnicities and audiences. I view it as our mission to showcase as many different worlds as possible. So for us, our goal is to really highlight and showcase different countries and cultures that we aren't seeing otherwise. A good example of a film for that this year was we showed a film about the Hungarian Revolution. And again, something that some of you may have lived through or heard about, but most of us don't know a lot about. And this is a documentary that we'd had films related to this topic before, but by showing this, I felt like we sort of established, okay, look, we've shown this film, we can kind of continue the discussion in future years whenever we have other Eastern European films. We know that our audiences will have this as a jumping off point. So again, we don't have a quota system. We pick films that strike us, that interest us, that we think might fit a niche. I'll tell you, if you're thinking about making some movies, I can tell you some kinds of movies that we'd love to see. I would love to see some music documentaries that don't follow the traditional like rock star documentary that's produced by the rock band it's about. So it paints them in a very flattering light at the end. I'd love to see another Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, for instance, if anybody has seen that rock documentary. And short films. Earlier this morning, a student asked about short films and if a 40-minute short film would be an appropriate film to submit to for a distributor to see, to show them what kind of work they do. And from a film festival point of view, what we see is that that's a TV length kind of movie. We want them either really feature length or really, really short. I love 3-minute movies. I cannot tell you how great they are, because you can be done with them in 3 minutes if they're crap. They're just so easy to watch. But we get so many 25 to 35-minute films, which just takes so much time and energy, and the filmmaker is so excited and passionate about it, and it just so doesn't pay off. So anyway, I kind of rambled there, but that kind of address it, I hope. Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, in the back.
Do film festival curators know what happened to all those good films that show at festivals? And then if I see them at a festival, I've never been able to teach them. It's sort of the maker and the film drop off, and the world is edge or something, and I never know what happened to them.
That is the number one complaint that I have heard from audiences before, and that is either I saw this film at your festival and loved it and want my niece and uncle and aunt and sister and cousin and everyone to see it, or I missed the film and I really wanted to see it because it's about ballroom dancing in Botswana, and that's my uncle. He teaches, whatever. The thing that I think has happened literally in the last just couple years is films, because of the internet, there's a raised awareness among filmmakers that a film is not a one-shot deal. You don't just make a movie and walk away and it has its life and it goes and does its thing. That's the Hollywood method, where you make a movie, you sell it to somebody, and you kind of sit there and you maybe do a few interviews for it, but it just kind of has a life of its own. In the independent film world today, you have to ride with that film for a year or 2 years, 10 years. That film is a part of your life as well. And I think filmmakers are starting to see that, and they're starting to see that they have to promote and be the biggest advocate for their own careers and their own films. So you're seeing much more work that filmmakers are doing to stay in touch with audiences. So if you go to a festival and you see a film, a lot more now you'll see filmmakers, like you see all the time at rock concerts or something, at small venues when people are just kind of emerging artists, passing around mailing lists forms, and you can connect with them through their websites, and some of them even sell their DVDs out in the lobby after the film. You're seeing a lot more of that engagement with the audience. You're seeing it become more like the music industry has been. Instead of being the filmmaker and the audience, you're really seeing the filmmaker engage. And that happens, I think, with blogs, with things like Facebook and Twitter and MySpace. I think audiences have really come closer to the filmmakers, and filmmakers are really able to engage. Now, specifically, what's happened to all the films that you'd like to see? I'd advise you to look on IMDb, first of all, Internet Movie Database, which is a great sort of database of just random film arcane knowledge and contacts. It's 6 1/2 dozen the other. There's a decent chance you'll find a link to a website, or you'll find some information about the film. You'll be able to buy a DVD of it, or find where it's playing in the world. There's so many films. Again, we talked about quantity. You're not going to see, I don't think, a reemergence of archival cinema. That's something that's been proven to not work in a lot of formats. You're not going to see big tours of, here's the French New Wave cinema, we're going to bring it back around so you all can see. And here's 3 years ago, this collection of films that you missed, we're going to bring them all back. The world's moved on. We're ready to see new things. You'll see places in New York and in Cinematheques, you'll see these films continue to be played, but mass audiences are not really clamoring for old films. So if you have an interest in a film that has played or that you heard about, you need to seek it out. And chances are, if it's a film that's been made in the last 3-4 years, there's a really good likelihood that that film is either available to you on DVD or that you can get in touch with the filmmaker, and if it's not available on DVD, you could ask them to burn you a copy on their computer, and they'll send it to you, or she'll send it to you. So I recognize your concern on that, and I would say that things are getting better. So you'll be able to connect better with filmmakers if you continue to take chances at festivals. So are we doing any other questions? Last opportunity. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.